1,100%. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering increase in the number of incarcerated drug offenders in the United States between 1980 and 2003. I mean, imagine looking at any system in our society and seeing it literally multiply in size 11 times over in just a couple of decades. It's a massive, seismic shift that completely transformed the American justice system. And today, we're going to look at the data to figure out exactly how and why that happened.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating definitive report by the Sentencing Project called A 25-Year Quagmire, the War on Drugs and its Impact on American Society. We'll be taking an objective look at the data and the trends gathered from this comprehensive review to really understand the policies of the past quarter century and the profound ripple effects they've had on communities all across the country.
Okay, here's our game plan for today. We're going to break this down into 4 parts. First, the arrest boom. Second, misplaced priorities. Third, the racial divide. And finally, treatment versus punishment.
Let's start right off with part 1, the arrest boom. Millions arrested.
So back in the early 1980s, the Reagan administration officially launched the war on drugs, and that brought a massive surge in law enforcement funding. And you can see the sheer scale of that change right in the data. If we look at the total number of drug offenders in state prisons, federal prisons, and local jails, we go from an estimated 41,100 people in 1980 to nearly 500,000, 493,800 to be exact, by 2003. It's like watching a balloon inflate right before your eyes, completely reshaping the entire footprint of the correctional system.
Now, you might be wondering, who exactly was getting caught up in this huge boom? Well, by 2005, total drug arrests hit a record high of 1.84 million. But the data reveals something pretty unexpected. The vast majority of these people weren't high-level cartel bosses. Actually, more than 81% of these arrests were strictly for possession, while only about 18% were for sales. And get this, over 42% of all drug arrests were just for marijuana offenses. So the data clearly shows a massive shift in enforcement, targeting low-level possession-based offenses.
And, there are no cost-free choices in public policy, right? Prioritizing low-level drug arrests naturally meant pulling vital law enforcement resources away from other safety issues. For example, economists at Florida State University looked at Illinois between 1984 and 1999. While drug arrests surged by 47%, arrests for drunk driving actually dropped by 22.5%. When you focus heavily on one thing, you inevitably pull attention from another. It's a classic example of unintended consequences.
Moving on to part 2, misplaced priorities. Catching kingpins?
So did these policies actually capture the high-level operators? To understand the original intent, we have to look directly at the legislative record from the 1980s. The goal of the mandatory sentencing structure at the time was to, and I quote, create the proper incentives for the Department of Justice to direct its most intense focus on major traffickers and serious traffickers. The explicit plan was to harness heavy federal resources against highly sophisticated, large-scale drug enterprises that local police just couldn't handle on their own.
But actually, here is where the data reveals a stark contrast between what they intended and what really happened. According to research by the U.S. Sentencing Commission on federal crack cocaine defendants, over 60% were actually categorized as low-level street dealers, couriers, or assistants. Instead of taking down just the major kingpins as intended, the majority of federal criminal justice resources ended up being directed at low and mid-level crimes.
And this wasn't just a federal thing. The state systems mirrored this almost perfectly. A 2002 report found that 58% of all drug offenders in state prison had absolutely no history of violence or high-level drug selling activity. That's roughly 125,000 nonviolent individuals locked up, and the report suggests many of them could have been prime candidates for non-custodial diversion programs instead of sitting in prison cells.
Let's bring this down to the human level for a second to really see the impact of these priorities. This heavy emphasis on low-level arrests has had a uniquely profound effect on women. By 2005, 29% of women in prison were there for a drug offense, and it gets even tougher when they get out. Because of 1996 federal welfare legislation, anyone convicted of a drug felony faces a lifetime ban on receiving welfare benefits. That's a massive, lifelong roadblock for women and mothers just trying to transition back into society.
Which brings us to part 3, the racial divide, the disproportionate impact.
This is where we see a really staggering staircase of disparity. According to the data,
African Americans make up about 14% of monthly drug users, which, by the way, generally reflects their proportion of the total U.S. population. Yet, they account for 37% of those arrested for drug offenses and a massive 56% of those in state prison for a drug conviction. The rates of enforcement and incarceration just completely outpace the actual baseline usage rates.
A huge piece of this puzzle stems from federal sentencing laws, specifically the difference in how crack cocaine and powder cocaine are treated. Even though they're chemically identical substances, the legal threshold to trigger a 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence is just 5 grams for crack cocaine compared to 500 grams for powder cocaine. This 100-to-1 ratio means that crack offenses are mathematically punished way more severely than any other type of drug offense.
So how does that legal disparity actually play out in the real world? Well, despite government data showing that 2/3 of regular crack cocaine users are white or Latino, an overwhelming 82% of defendants sentenced in federal court for crack offenses are African American. It's a stark reality. When discretionary policing in specific neighborhoods meets incredibly severe mandatory minimums, the result is a massively disproportionate impact on African American communities.
Finally, let's look at Part 4, Treatment versus Punishment, the Cost of Incarceration. So, we've looked at the arrests, we've looked at the demographics, but it all boils down to one absolutely crucial question. Is prison actually curing addiction? With millions arrested and hundreds of thousands incarcerated over the last few decades, you'd naturally assume that rehabilitation was a huge part of this massive system. Well, let's see what the data says.
The research reveals a pretty shocking paradox here. As the number of incarcerated people with substance abuse issues surged over the decades, the proportion actually receiving professional treatment plummeted by more than half. In state prisons, treatment participation for regular drug users dropped from 36.5% in 1991 down to just 14.1% in 2004. And we see a nearly identical collapse in the federal system. Our prisons filled up with people demonstrating severe dependencies, but the services to actually address that addiction, they just dried up. But imagine if we invested in treatment instead. A recent analysis of substance abuse programs in California found a phenomenal return on investment. For every $1 spent on substance abuse treatment, taxpayers save $7 from reduced crime and increased earnings. It proves that professionally designed treatment isn't just a compassionate approach. Mathematically, it literally pays for itself compared to simply warehousing individuals in prison.
So, I'll leave you with this. After 25 years, billions of dollars spent, and millions of people arrested, does the war on drugs need a new strategy? We've seen this massive gap between the original idea of catching kingpins and the reality of overflowing prisons filled with low-level, nonviolent offenders. We've looked at the staggering demographic disparities, and we've seen the sharp decline in actual addiction treatment. The data we've walked through today certainly leaves us questioning the effectiveness of the past quarter century. Does the war on drugs need a fundamentally new strategy? Thanks for joining me on this explainer.